On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Jordan Stone. He's the Vice President of Engineering at Paytient. We're going to be talking about a pretty interesting topic. He mentioned that documentation has been helping the team scale, and we're going to be talking about what that really means. He's got a pretty distributed team, obviously not a lot of overlap, and people have to be able to take the baton and pass it consistently and cleanly. And I think Jordan has some interesting learnings that he'll share with us. Jordan, I want to thank you for being on the podcast.
Yeah, Amir, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Absolutely. All right, so let's start off at the top. Two things I always like to know is obviously, what the company does and what your responsibilities are. There are where we like to start. So I'll let you go ahead there.
So Paytient is kind of on a mission to make accessing and affording healthcare better, easier for everybody. We do that by offering folks a physical or virtual card that they can use to pay for their out-of-pocket medical, dental, vision, pharmacy, veterinary expenses, any of those things that have kind of a doctor component to them, and then break that payment up over time without any interest or fees. And so that's what Paytient is. And my role as the VP of Engineering is really helping to set sort of broader technical direction for the team, as well as obviously growing the team, developing the team, and empowering them to go off and do their best work. So that's kind of my day-to-day.
Awesome. Sounds like a very exciting business. I'm sure we could spend a whole half hour talking about that, but we'll stick to the topic, which was interesting when we first spoke about it, and documentation and how it helps teams scale and, improve quality and solve some other problems. I guess to kind of start, I alluded to the fact that you have a distributed team. You guys are spread out. I think it'd be good context. Maybe I just understand how your team is set up and how distributed you guys are and that type of thing.
Sure. So like I'd mentioned, we're globally distributed. So we've got folks all the way as east, depending on your perspective, as Portugal, and then kind of on the other side, various time zones within the US. So I'm in Denver. The Portugal team is 7 hours ahead of me. And so we really only have a couple of hours of overlap to kind of do a lot of the more traditional synchronous communication, designing, debating, brainstorming, that sort of thing.
Awesome. Do you guys run some form of Agile, some form of Scrum, assuming?
We do, yeah. So kind of traditional Scrum, 2-week sprints. We use it very much to help us sort of plan work. We're releasing new code out into production as frequently as we can, but from a planning cycle perspective, a traditional Scrum team.
Awesome. So I guess, just thinking about this, you guys don't get a ton of overlap, or gals, guys, generally speaking, but the team itself, probably would have challenges of finding meetings, collaborating. Like, are those obvious common issues with the limited time that you guys have with each other?
They definitely are. And, we have a daily stand-up where the whole team kind of syncs up once a day. And that is super helpful. But as we have continued to grow, we will often say like every 6 months, we're kind of a new business, right? We've got new customers, new employees, everything is changing so rapidly. Kind of over time, it can get more difficult for us to kind of remember 3 months ago or 6 months ago, why did we make this decision or why did we do it that way? So it's kind of both day-to-day coordination as well as, I'll say, coordination over time.
Absolutely. So I guess, some of the thought around documentation and helping the team scale, I guess that's kind of just a broad statement. Maybe we can kind of, dial that back in and kind of get a little bit more granular around what we're talking about around that documentation, and maybe that's a good just starting point.
So I'm an engineer by trade. So I recognize that documentation is kind of this dirty word inside of engineering where folks just want to be writing code and not necessarily writing things down to document the things that they're doing outside of maybe, commenting code, I think is a little bit more common. But what we've found and what I've sort of seen at various teams over the course of my career is the context around like why a decision was made and what were the trade-offs of that decision relative to another decision tends to get lost. And so it's really easy, like you mentioned at the outset, to go to the source code, reverse engineer that source code if you're a new member on the team and say, okay, I understand how things work today, but why did we choose to do it this way and not that way? That part tends to get lost, and teams spend a lot of time revisiting those decisions and sort of having the same discussion. Maybe you're lucky enough to have the Slack skills to go back and search through history to figure out why a decision was made if that conversation happened in Slack. But if it was part of a meeting or a conversation, it's in the ether, it's gone forever. So it's this idea of kind of helping our future selves, helping our future teammates by writing down a little bit of context around decisions so that when we ask ourselves, hey, why do we do it this way? We know the answer to that. It's different than I think the traditional thought process around documentation, which is heavy detail. Let's make sure that every method and structure and every data structure is sort of documented. That's not the kind of documentation that we talk about at Paytient when we're talking about writing things down. It's intended to be lightweight, but help provide some of that context.
Gotcha. And that's interesting. I think you mentioned something about, spending a lot of time revisiting the same decisions. And especially if you happen to have team members leave, you lose a lot of that tribal knowledge and that context can easily slide into nowhere. But when you're looking at a team and they're understanding the context, how much of improvement is there? Or is there an improvement when they go look at the source code to be able to just get to some of the technical side of the things that they're looking to understand when they're looking at just purely from a code perspective?
I think what we've found is that implementation tends to be easier when we write things down ahead of time. And I think there's, to a certain extent, this kind of cultural chasm you've got to jump where engineers tend to think, hey, if I'm not writing code, I'm not being productive. And so documentation is unproductive time. But the fact of the matter is, we're hiring strong engineers because we want them to solve hard problems, and hard problems are hard to solve by their very nature. And so what we found is that taking that time up front helps the implementation go better because a couple of things that we found. One is it gives us a mechanism to sort of share an idea early on to get feedback on how we might go about solving a problem before you get to the kind of the pull request at the end of the process. If you think that writing code is kind of the most expensive thing that you can do in the product development process, then waiting until the end of that part to start to get feedback through the regular pull request review process tends to be particularly expensive. The other thing is it helps us sort of justify why this change is important. My perspective on this is if you can't write down in regular words why it's important for us to spend time on a change or explain how you're going to design a system, it's going to be really hard to translate that into code that is testable and easy to review and easy to maintain. So we've sort of seen these peripheral improvements around the quality of the solutions just by spending a little bit of time up front writing stuff down.
Awesome. Just to clarify, just because I might have not caught it, but just for anyone listening is, where is this captured? Like what kind of repository? Is it, Google Doc? Where are you guys keeping this, documentation for the context of the code? Was it within GitHub itself or where is it going?
Yeah, good question. So we do it in Confluence. Teams do it different ways. I think another popular way to do it is sort of put it in GitHub right next to the rest of the source code. The idea there being if it's close to the place that engineers are spending the rest of their time, it's more likely to stay up to date. But I will say one of the things I really like about using Confluence for this, one, it's really easy to search and sort of link things together. So we will link our PRDs, our product requirements documents, to our RFCs, requests for comments, the thing we use for technical documentation, so that folks can easily see, hey, these business requirements are getting translated into this technical solution. The other thing that's really nice about Confluence is it gives you the estimated reading time at the top. And it's a good gut check to make sure that these aren't getting to be these really long, wordy, hard to read documents that no one's actually going to take the time to invest in. We try to target a 5-minute estimated reading time as being enough to get the idea across and communicate the details, but not so much that it's immediately out of date as soon as you hit publish. So those two features are actually a big reason why we continue to use Confluence for this.
Very cool. I like it. Keep that reading time to 5-minute limit. I think that seems pretty fair. I guess when you're looking at the team, who participates? I guess, is it everyone on the team, specific people in charge of comments? Is it, if I have an idea, like you mentioned, if you can't put in, a short synopsis, then, how are we going to implement it? Who's responsible for actually adding to the comment repository?
One of the things I like the most about this idea of kind of writing this stuff down is that it democratizes the ability for anyone on the team to have an idea. We usually like to have a senior engineer or myself or the CTO kind of review things to make sure that they make sense before they're kind of finally approved to go out the door. But anyone on the team can propose a new idea or take on the design of a feature. it helps to sort of grow more engineers, right? If you only have one person responsible for architecture or big A architecture, then it's hard for other folks on the team to find opportunities to grow. This has sort of given anyone on the team who has an idea or wants to lead the implementation of a new feature the ability to kind of do that and drive it forward. So anyone can do it.
Awesome. How far, I guess this maybe gets a little bit more detailed with the comment itself. So I guess if anyone can do it, I have an idea on the team, I want to put something into the Confluence repository. How much detail? Like, you mentioned to keep it to 5 minutes and obviously keep it as simple as possible, but no simpler. How much are you expecting someone to come to the table with the idea? Because I think a lot of times, or not even ideas, but I guess ideas. I think a lot of times people have great ideas and it's always like, well, how do you do this? How much of that, context, how much of the baseline do you need for somebody to be putting into a comment or an idea?
So we have a Confluence template for this. At the top of the template is a background and the context, right? Like, why is this worth spending time on? What are we trying to do? And it's stuff as simple as I wrote an RFC the other day around standardizing our naming conventions for our secrets manager, all the way to how are we going to roll out our big migration from Elastic Beanstalk to containers. We're on AWS. So we did that several months ago, right? So it's small and large. That part of it is kind of the most important piece. Inside of that or below that, we've got, hey, is this going to affect compliance? Does someone from the compliance team need to know about this? Are we handling new kinds of data? Does someone from security need to know about it? So it's a great way to kind of coordinate and notify stakeholders about changes to the system as well. The implementation details, specifically how we're going to do that, can be a little bit lighter because we're agile. We haven't necessarily planned it all out. The goal is not to, again, have this super robust, highly detailed technical document. But the idea is to be able to sort of frame out big milestones that we can start to chart against. And then the team will take up the mantle of breaking that out into whatever makes sense for them in order to deliver the work.
Very cool. Are there any metrics that you've seen improving with this added context of decision making?
Yeah, I think our kind of on-time delivery of major, especially technical projects, has gone a lot better. We've also seen that kind of broader involvement in decision making has gone up a good bit. One, because we're distributed, and two, because this is not necessarily unique to engineers, but I think engineers have this stereotypical introverted personality. It gives folks the ability to kind of mull over an idea and contribute in a way that they may not be comfortable with. If someone just said, hey, I think we should do X in a meeting, and you kind of have maybe the loudest voice or the most senior voice in the room participating in that conversation, and quieter folks tend to be a little bit less involved. We've seen broader involvement, broader engagement. Onboarding is also a lot faster as a consequence of this. It's much easier for folks to come onto the team, understand broad strokes. What are the broader architectural decisions that we're making, standards, norms, things like that, so they can get to contributing members of the team a lot faster. Those are all, positives that we've seen over the last several months.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting. So, you're seeing a broader involvement in decision making that's improved. You mentioned a few minutes ago, and it is a fair stigma that if I'm not writing code, I'm not being productive as an engineer. Have you seen that shifting with, hey, this involvement in documentation is not just to, define the code, it's to understand the how and the why. Have you seen more people adopting it, broadly? Or maybe some of those people that previously would have viewed documentation as just a waste of their time?
Yeah, definitely. Is everyone on the team writing RFCs? Not necessarily, and that's okay. But I think broadly speaking, we're seeing more folks have the opportunity to participate in the ideation technical design process, which again gives some really great growth opportunities to people who I don't think previously were always getting that chance. It's not without its challenges for sure, and I'm sure we'll talk through some of that a little bit, but it continues to be a learning process for us, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was actually maybe a good segue to, I was going to ask you about challenges. And it sounds like if I'm an engineering leader and I'm just listening, I'm like, hey, this is, maybe I'm documenting, but not documenting some of the, context of the decisions being made. And it seems like there's a lot of positives. I guess from the flip side of some of the challenges, maybe if you can touch on some of those.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the ones that I've seen pretty consistently, having done this at a couple companies now, is when do you write an RFC? How big of a decision is big enough? How small of a decision is too small to warrant writing that context down or adding another document to your repository? I think this is more art than science. And what I've seen be successful is helping to provide some guidelines and then letting the team make decisions around whether or not that context is going to be helpful or not, whether or not the change impacts other teams is a good guideline, if there's a breaking change that someone needs to know about, those sorts of things. But not putting that in place early enough in a past company led to a lot of decisions just not getting written down because no one knew that they needed to write them down. And that's completely reasonable. I think also for folks who spend a very small amount of time writing down their ideas in prose, it's, I think, more common for folks to go from feature maybe in a Jira ticket to I'm going to start writing code for it. It's harder to make the jump from here's this feature, let me write down my approach in words and then translate that to code. So it's maybe a bit of a technical writing skill that folks need to kind of build and practice until they get good at it. That's one thing that just kind of comes with time and practice. But being okay, being uncomfortable the first couple of times you write an RFC is another one. And then I think the third one is just this idea of making sure you've got this safe space for people to put those ideas out there. Sometimes those ideas are early on. They're not always fully formed. And it's, for us, has been a focus on let's make sure we're getting to the right idea and not necessarily the person proposing it feeling like they need to be right or they need to have the best solution from the very beginning. It takes a lot of trust and psychological safety, I think, to kind of put those ideas out there in a form that anyone in the company can go and read and understand. Sometimes writing it in source code is this like black magic secret art that only a select few can really understand. And so we're kind of this idea of democratizing those ideas and making them more available can, I think, can be scary. I mean, I feel that sometimes when I put my ideas out there, I'm like, oh, I hope this makes sense to everybody. And that's, like I said, just kind of comes with time and with practice.
Absolutely. The one thing I was thinking about as you're mentioning that is it's the adoption. Obviously, you mentioned, people, see the benefit. Not everyone's involved. I guess from the flip side of managing this, right? Like, somebody's got to sit down. You mentioned the review process. Obviously, if the number of RFCs increase too much, can you keep up with it? Where do you make time for that review process as a part of, the overall team process? And how does the overall team review that? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that actual review side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we encourage folks to not keep those RFCs open for too long, just like a pull request, right? The longer it's open, the less relevant it becomes, the staler it becomes. So we have in Confluence a summary page that shows the status of all of the documents that we have. Are they proposed, in review, accepted, rejected? So we can kind of prioritize the ones that haven't been reviewed or approved. For larger ones, especially if it's part of someone's sprint work spikes, if we're trying to research the best way to do something, we'll often track it in our ticketing system. And again, I think it's really about empowering the team to be able to collectively review and move these things forward, as opposed to having a governing body like I'm not there approving or rejecting every single recommendation that comes out of the whole team. That's definitely not scalable. It's really about finding shared agreement amongst the team around what makes for good decisions and what makes for not good decisions, and having other tools in place to make sure that the decisions coming out of that process actually make sense. So we're looking at code quality, we're looking at other metrics to make sure that the decisions that we're making early on are actually coming to fruition the way that we had anticipated.
Interesting. I guess if I were listening to this and we have documentation, we're not capturing the context as consistently, it's something I'd want to do. Any recommendation of how to start? Is it, hey, just you dive in? Because obviously, something like this is a lot of habit within a team. This is the culture of the team to do this. But where would you start if you had to advise somebody of best practice?
There's tons of resources around available for folks. This is certainly not an idea that I invented. I'm standing on some pretty tall shoulders here. But our first RFC was an RFC about RFCs. Very meta, but it sort of laid out not only the format, so the implementation, the suggestion was, hey, I think it should be formatted like this with these fields, these sections, but it helped that context and background section, helped kind of justify the reasoning and sort of got folks familiar with the idea of how to write one, how to review one, what the kind of workflow was. And I think just using it for all kinds of decisions as you sort of exercise that muscle and try to figure out what's too big of a decision or too small of a decision. We're using it as we bring on new tools. We're using it as we make changes to process. We're using it as we design new features. I mean, it's not just for, hey, we have to deploy a new API. Let's write a document for it. We're trying to build sort of organizational context, if you will, not just always technical context. And you just have to do a lot of it, I think, to build that muscle and build that habit.
Absolutely. It seems like a lot of it would be about, getting the team to do it consistently and being a part of the overall larger view and process. Yeah, definitely cool to see how you guys use it. Sounds like it's working for the team. Hopefully other people will listen to it that aren't doing, or, just will help them kind of compare notes. If somebody does want to reach out to you to hit you up on anything you've mentioned regarding this topic, what's a good way of doing that? LinkedIn, another social platform?
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone can shoot me an email, jordan@paytient.com. Super easy. LinkedIn as well. Twitter. I think I'm in most of those places.
Okay, awesome. We'll make sure to include those. And then I've been asking guests if there is a topic they'd like to leave behind so that potentially a future guest can speak to. Is there anything in particular you'd like a future guest to maybe cover from a topic perspective?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'm interested to maybe hear other people's perspectives on hiring right now. I think everybody's kind of struggling with hiring. It's an interesting market, I'll say. We've had success in various places that I think we hadn't had success or hadn't tried in the past. So I'm always curious to hear where people are finding folks today and how they're going about bringing the best and brightest to their own teams.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time, Jordan. A great topic to cover. I think lots of insights. So I appreciate you sharing.
Thanks, Amir. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guests, different topic. Until then, let's hopefully share the podcast. If you guys did enjoy it, that's how it's been growing. So I thank everyone that does every week. And secondly, if you know someone that wants to come on to talk about, Jordan's topic request, perspectives on hiring right now, I think that's something that a lot of people probably are looking at. But if you got some insights or views on how you're dealing with hiring in this market and trying to bring the best and brightest on, ping me on LinkedIn, let me know. And I'd love to have you on the show. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.